Hello, it's me. No, not that one yet. I haven't got there. I'm number 3. Well, there's a lot of us, but we're all part of the same team. We like to make documentaries about the history of places. You know, where did the place names come from? Why are they spelled like that and not like that? How do the locals feel about their town or city? And of course, how did the world end up looking like this? So today we're going to take a look at Jerusalem. More specifically, we're going to take a look at what happened in 587 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, then sit down, relax, and enjoy the show. All right, so let's just start with the basics. Who is Nebuchadnezzar and why does he want to destroy Jerusalem? Well, back in those days, Mesopotamia was kind of like the Mid-East version of the Roman Empire. They were huge, powerful, and had a pretty big military. But as the Bible tells it, God chose to work through the Babylonians to punish his people for being naughty. See, at this time, the Jews were living in 2 separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. And neither of them were very happy about being ruled by the other. Plus, both of them were pretty naughty, but Judah was especially bad. God said through the prophet Jeremiah that he would punish Judah and exile them across the Euphrates River, which at the time was basically the equivalent of saying, "I'm going to send you to Mars." Also, the Babylonians weren't just some random country that God picked out of nowhere. The Babylonians were actually descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth's brother, making them related to Abraham. In fact, God told Abraham that one of his descendants would be kings over a land far away, probably referring to Babylon. So in the grand scheme of things, the Babylonian Empire wasn't too far off from being considered family. Anyway, after a few years of threatening and negotiating, the Babylonians decided to go to war with Judah. After besieging the city for several months, Jerusalem finally fell to the Babylonian army in 597 BCE, and many of the Jewish nobles, along with the sacred temple treasures, were taken to Babylon. Then a group of rebels tried to take back the city, but failed, and even more people got taken to Babylon. Finally, in 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem and destroyed the city. He burned the temple and took the remaining valuables back to Babylon. Whatever was left over, he pillaged and destroyed. The city walls, houses, gardens, farmlands, wells, everything. He even dug a gigantic trench around the city. So anybody who dared enter the city would have to cross a moat filled with corpses. Nebuchadnezzar then deported everyone remaining in the city to Babylon, including King Zedekiah. Now, most historians agree with this basic telling of events, but there's some debate as to why the destruction of Jerusalem was such a big deal. I mean, they rebuilt after the first destruction, right? Well, yes, but here's the thing. According to the Bible, the destruction of Jerusalem didn't just happen once, it happened twice. There's a gap of 70 years between the first destruction and the second destruction, and people were still living in Jerusalem during that time. So why would Nebuchadnezzar destroy the city a second time if he already got rid of everyone in the city the first time? Well, it really depends on what you think happened during those 70 years. According to the Bible, King Evil Merodach of Babylon enacted a genocide against the Jews of Babylon. Then King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon and issued an edict allowing the Jews to return home and rebuild the temple. Some historians believe that the Jews who returned home were mostly foreigners who converted to Judaism. But if that were true, then wouldn't Nebuchadnezzar have just exiled the real Jews to Babylon like he did to everyone else? Others argue that the foreign converts never made up more than a small minority of the Jewish population. And while it's true that many Jews were taken to Babylon, there were always some Jews who remained hidden in Judea. So when Cyrus came into power, these Jews were able to emerge once again. Whatever the case, the Jews returned to Jerusalem and began rebuilding the city and the temple. But shortly after construction began, the prophet Haggai and Zechariah began telling the people that God was displeased with their progress. God said that he wanted them to finish his house so that he could fill it with his glory. Now some believe that the people were purposefully ignoring God, and that's why Haggai and Zechariah had to yell at them. But others say that the people were just being practical. Building a house for God was important, sure, but so was building a house for themselves. After all, many of them had lost their homes and were living in tents or with friends and relatives. The book of Nehemiah tells the story of how the people eventually finished rebuilding the temple walls in only 52 days. But the book of Ezra tells of how the people struggled for 16 years to finish the job. It doesn't matter which version is true, though. The point is that the Jews were trying to rebuild their lives when suddenly Nebuchadnezzar came back and destroyed the city again. Now it's worth noting that there's no extra biblical evidence of a second destruction of Jerusalem during the reigns of either evil Merodach or Cyrus. In fact, Cyrus is even mentioned in the book of Esther, which takes place in Shushan, the ancient Persian capital. During the story, Esther, who happens to be the king's wife, reveals her Jewish identity to save her people from genocide. So if the Jews were completely gone from Jerusalem, then Esther wouldn't have been queen, and Mordecai wouldn't have been in Shushan begging Cyrus for help. But even if the Jews hadn't completely abandoned Jerusalem, why would Cyrus allow another genocide against them? Well, the simple answer is that we don't know. Some scholars theorize that the second destruction of Jerusalem was an invention by the Jews to explain the destruction of the Second Temple, which actually did happen in 516 BCE. But the more popular theory among biblical scholars is that the Jews really did return to Jerusalem and rebuild, but they kept getting attacked by local governors and rulers who didn't want them there. The book of Maccabees tells of how the Jews rebelled against Antiochus IV Epiphanes after he desecrated the temple. But the trouble started long before that. In fact, according to 2nd Maccabees, the Jews were constantly having to fight off invaders throughout the entire 70-year period. So what we really have here is a situation where the Bible says one thing, but the secular evidence says another. So who do you believe? Well, that's up to you. All I can do is tell you what the sources say. And speaking of sources, let's take a look at what the non-biblical sources have to say about the destruction of Jerusalem. The first extra-biblical account of the destruction of Jerusalem comes from the Babylonian Chronicle, which is a series of clay tablets that record important events in Babylonian history. The tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder also tells of how Cyrus captured Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Both of these accounts line up perfectly with the biblical accounts. But there are also accounts from other civilizations that imply the destruction of Jerusalem happened later than 587 BCE. For example, the Book of Kings says that the Philistines destroyed the city of Ashkelon in 586 BCE. But the Teldan stele, which was discovered in 1993, implies that the destruction of Ashkelon happened in 573 BCE. This would suggest that the Jews couldn't have returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt until after 573 BCE, because otherwise, why would the Philistines attack and destroy a city that was occupied by the Jews? And if the Jews weren't allowed to return until after 573 BCE, then that means that the second destruction of Jerusalem happened after 573 BCE. But as tempting as it is to read too much into one archaeological find, that's probably just reading too much into it. The truth is, we don't have any extra biblical accounts that mention the Jews returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding. And that's kind of weird because we have accounts of the Assyrians deporting the Israelites and the Babylonians deporting the Judeans, but we don't have any accounts of the Jews ever returning to the land of Israel. Does that mean that they didn't return? Of course not. But it does leave us wondering why. Why would the empires that conquered Israel and Judah allow the Jews to return to their homeland? Was it because the Jews were useful to them? Was it because the Jews paid a hefty ransom? Or was it simply because nobody cared about a small group of nomads? We'll probably never know. What's really interesting about the destruction of Jerusalem is that it plays a big role in Christianity and Islam, too. Christians believe that Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem, and Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad did. Maybe we should make a documentary about that. That could be fun. But today we've covered enough material for one day, so let's bring things to a close. As you can see, there's a lot of debate surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. There are multiple versions of events, but we may never know which version is 100% true. But you know what we do know? We know that you guys are awesome for watching this whole video, so thank you so much. If you like this video, then please hit that thumbs up button. If you love this channel, then consider supporting us. And if you want to see more videos like this, then subscribe and click the bell so you never miss an upload. Until next time, I'm signing off.